The river was calm that morning. Too calm. The kind of stillness that makes you uneasy without knowing why. A thin mist hovered just above the water's surface, curling and uncurling like something breathing in its sleep. The air smelled damp and metallic, mixed with the sweetness of crushed reeds under bare feet. Somewhere in the distance a bird cried out, sharp, sudden, then went silent again, as if it had seen something it wasn't supposed to see. You see, rivers remember things. People forget. Towns move on. Names fade. But rivers keep secrets for a very long time. And on this particular morning, long before the sun fully rose, a man stood at the river's edge with a bundle in his arms, his hands trembling so badly he had to press them against his chest to keep from dropping it. His name was Elijah. He was enslaved, and the bundle he held was still breathing. Now, imagine for a second what that kind of moment feels like. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, not screaming, not chaos, just the quiet horror of being alone with a decision you never wanted to make. The kind where your heart is pounding so loudly you're sure the river can hear it. The kind where your mouth is dry, your legs feel weak, and you keep whispering the same words under your breath over and over again. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. But there was a problem. The order hadn't come from a stranger. It hadn't even come from a man. It had come from her, Margaret Whitcomb. And years later, when everyone believed the story was over, the river gave something back. Something that should never have returned. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back, because this story doesn't begin at the river. It begins inside a house that smelled of polished wood, lavender soap, and power. Margaret Whitcomb had never thought of herself as cruel. That's important to understand. She was born into comfort, married into wealth, and raised to believe that order, strict, unyielding order, was the backbone of civilization. Her dresses were always pressed, her voice was always calm, her posture never slouched. Even when she was angry, she spoke softly, especially then. People like Margaret didn't scream, they didn't strike in fits of rage. They issued instructions, and those instructions changed lives. The Whitcomb plantation sat just beyond the bend of the river, perched on slightly higher ground like it was watching the water below. White columns, wide verandas, windows that reflected sunlight so brightly they hurt to look at. From a distance it looked peaceful, almost beautiful. But beauty can lie. Inside those walls lived dozens of enslaved people, men, women, children, whose lives were measured not in years, but in usefulness. Among them was Elijah. Elijah was tall, even by free standards, with hands that bore the thick scars of years of field labor. He had been born on the plantation, just like his mother before him. He knew the rhythms of the place the way a sailor knows the sea, the sound of the bell before dawn, the creak of the main house stairs, the way Margaret's footsteps were lighter than her husband's. He also knew when something was wrong, and something had been wrong for weeks. It started with whispers, not loud ones, not obvious ones, the kind that travel through glances and unfinished sentences, the kind that die the moment someone else walks into the room. Elijah noticed the way the women stopped talking when Margaret passed by, the way the overseer lingered too long near the slave quarters at night, the way Sarah, quiet, gentle Sarah, kept her head lowered, her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach. Sarah was young, 17, maybe 18, hard to say when birthdays weren't written down. She had been working in the house for the past year, cleaning floors, carrying trays, learning how to disappear when spoken over. And she was pregnant. Now that alone wasn't unusual. Enslaved women bore children all the time, children who would one day belong to the plantation the same way the land and tools did. But this pregnancy, this one carried danger, because the father wasn't enslaved, and Margaret Whitcomb knew it. You see, reputation mattered to Margaret more than almost anything else, more than comfort, more than kindness, more even than truth. The idea that a child could be born on her plantation who didn't fit neatly into her world, that terrified her. Not because of the child, but because of what people might say. And so, when Sarah went into labor late one humid night, there was no celebration, no quiet joy, no whispered prayers for a safe delivery. There was tension. The baby was born just before dawn, a boy, small, fragile, with skin lighter than the others, not pale, but lighter enough to raise questions. Sarah held him close, her eyes wet with exhaustion and love, whispering to him like she was afraid he might vanish if she stopped. She named him Samuel, just between the two of them, a secret name. But secrets don't last long on plantations. Margaret didn't come to see the baby right away. She waited, let the rumors settle, let the truth reveal itself. When she finally stood in the doorway of the small room where Sarah lay, her face gave nothing away. She looked at the baby once, then she looked at Elijah. "Elijah," she said, her voice steady, polite even, "I need you to take care of something for me." Now this is where it gets strange. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten him. She didn't even explain herself at first. She just gestured toward the river outside, the one that had carried crops and boats and reflections of the Whitcomb house for decades. "You're strong," she said. "You know the water. You'll know what to do." Elijah felt the room tilt. His ears rang. He looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide now, full of fear, her arms tightening around her child. "No," she whispered. "Please." Margaret turned to her then, finally letting a flicker of irritation show. "This is for the best, for everyone." And just like that, the decision was made. Not by Elijah, not by Sarah, but by a woman who would never touch the river herself. Elijah didn't remember walking out of the house. He didn't remember how the baby ended up in his arms. He only remembered the weight of Samuel's tiny body, the warmth of him, the soft, uneven breaths against his chest, and the sound of Sarah crying behind him. The river greeted him the same way it had always had, quiet, indifferent. It didn't rage, it didn't warn him, it simply flowed. Elijah stepped into the water, his feet sinking into the mud. Each step felt heavier than the last. He looked down at the baby. Samuel's eyes were open now, unfocused, trusting. And Elijah broke. He fell to his knees in the shallow water, clutching the child, tears streaming down his face. He whispered apologies. He begged a God he wasn't sure was listening. He stayed there longer than he should have. Long enough for someone to notice. Long enough for the river to make its own decision. Because when Elijah finally stood, when he finally loosened his grip just enough to let the water take the bundle from his arms, the baby didn't sink. It floated. Not drifting away, not disappearing, just there, rocking gently on the surface like the river itself refused the command it had been given. Elijah stared, frozen. And in that moment, a choice was made. Not Margaret's, not the overseer's. Elijah scooped Samuel back up, pressed him to his chest, and ran. Where he ran, who saw him, and what Margaret did when she realized the river hadn't obeyed her, that's where the story truly begins. Elijah didn't think, he didn't plan, he didn't even know where his feet were taking him. All he knew was that every second he stayed near that river, near that house, near Margaret Whitcomb's world, was another second closer to death, for him, for the child, for Sarah. Samuel was crying now, not loudly, just a thin, trembling sound like a kitten separated from its mother. Elijah pulled the cloth tighter around the baby's tiny body and ran through the trees, branches snapping against his arms, roots grabbing at his ankles, as if the earth itself was trying to stop him. Now, you have to understand something about running away in those days. It wasn't heroic the way stories sometimes make it sound. It wasn't freedom galloping towards you on horseback. It was hunger. It was fear. It was knowing that if you were caught, what happened next would be worse than death. And Elijah knew that. But he also knew this: if he went back without the baby, Margaret would assume the river had done its work. If he went back with the baby, there would be no pretending, no distance, no deniability. So he ran until his lungs burned and his legs shook. He ran until the cries in his ears were drowned out by the pounding of his own heart. And finally, when the sun began to rise and light spilled through the trees in thin golden lines, he stopped. He was miles from the plantation now, deep in a stretch of land where the river curved away from human eyes. Elijah collapsed beside a fallen log, cradling Samuel, rocking him back and forth like he'd seen mothers do. "I got you," he whispered. "I got you, for now." But for now was the problem. Because Elijah couldn't disappear with a newborn. He couldn't cross state lines with a crying child. He couldn't hide forever. And most of all, he couldn't bring the baby back to Sarah. Not yet. You see, Margaret Whitcomb wasn't the kind of woman who forgot unfinished business. Back at the plantation, the moment stretched longer than expected. Elijah didn't return. The sun climbed higher. The house began to stir. And Margaret noticed. At first, she assumed the delay was simple weakness. Elijah had always been soft-hearted in her opinion, too thoughtful, too slow to accept the natural order of things. She poured her tea, adjusted her gloves, and waited. But then the overseer came to her. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "Elijah hasn't come back." Margaret's hand paused mid-air. "How long has it been?" "An hour, maybe more." That flicker of irritation returned, sharper now. "Bring Sarah to me." Sarah could barely stand when they dragged her into the parlor. Her arms were empty. Her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal's. "Where is the child?" Margaret asked. Sarah shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "I don't know," she sobbed. "Please, I swear." Margaret stared at her for a long moment. Then she sighed, not in frustration, but in disappointment, like someone realizing a piece of furniture was defective. "Find him," she said to the overseer, quietly. And just like that, the hunt began. Dogs were brought in before nightfall. Elijah heard them before he saw them, the low, eager growls, the sound of paws tearing through underbrush. He knew that sound. Everyone did. He pressed Samuel closer to his chest, his mind racing. This was the moment where most stories end. This was where the river would have reclaimed the baby, where the dogs would have reclaimed Elijah, or both. But history isn't neat like that. Elijah remembered an old woman named Ruth. She lived alone in a shack near the bend of the river where the land dipped low and the fog settled thick in the mornings. People said she was strange, said she talked to herself, said she knew things she shouldn't. Elijah had helped her once, years ago, carrying water when she was sick. "She owes me nothing," he whispered, "but it's all I got." He changed direction, heading toward the thickest fog he could find. When the dogs reached the riverbank, they slowed. The scent was confused. Water erased things. Fog hid them. By the time the overseer realized Elijah had doubled back upstream, it was too late. Ruth opened her door without asking questions. She took one look at Elijah's face, at the baby in her arms, and stepped aside. "Come in before the river changes its mind." For 3 days Elijah stayed hidden in Ruth's shack. She fed him cornmeal and broth. She wrapped Samuel in old quilts. She never asked where the baby came from. On the fourth night, Ruth spoke. "That child don't belong to the river," she said softly. "But he don't belong to that house either." Elijah nodded. "I know." "There's a woman upriver," Ruth continued. "Free woman. Lost her own baby last winter. Ain't stopped mourning since. She might take him, raise him as hers." Elijah's chest tightened. "And Sarah, his mother?" he asked. Ruth's eyes darkened. "That's the wound that don't close." Elijah didn't sleep that night. At dawn he kissed Samuel's forehead. He whispered his name again, like a promise and a goodbye all at once. Then he handed him to Ruth. "Tell him," Elijah said. "Tell him I tried." Ruth nodded. Elijah left before the sun fully rose. By the time Margaret Whitcomb realized Elijah wasn't coming back, the trail had gone cold. No body, no child, no answers. And that unsettled her. Years passed. Sarah never spoke of the baby again. She lived, she worked, she aged too quickly. People said her eyes always looked like they were listening for something far away. Margaret grew older too. Her husband died. The plantation changed hands. Laws shifted. Chains loosened, then broke. The world moved forward, dragging its past behind it like a shadow. And the river kept flowing. Now, this is where most people think the story ends. A baby saved, a man vanished, a cruel order undone. But remember what I told you at the beginning. Rivers remember. Nearly 20 years later, after Margaret Whitcomb was buried beneath a polished stone engraved with words like devoted and upright, a terrible storm came through the valley. Rain fell for days. The river swelled beyond its banks, swallowing trees, fields, memories. And when the water finally receded, something was found tangled in the roots near the bend of the river, a small wooden box. Inside it was a scrap of cloth, faded but still recognizable, a tiny shirt, hand-stitched, and tucked inside, dry against all logic, was a folded piece of paper, a name, Samuel. The discovery spread through the town like a whisper that refused to die. People argued over what it meant. Some said it was coincidence, others said it was a curse. A few, very few, understood the truth, that the river hadn't taken the child. It had kept the secret, and now it was returning it. Because Samuel hadn't drowned, he had lived, and he was coming back. But not as a baby, not as a slave. And when Sarah, old, bent, her hair silvered by time, stood by the river once more and saw the man watching the water with familiar eyes, she knew. And in that moment, history stopped being a story. It became a reckoning. And that is where the river finally spoke. Sarah hadn't meant to go to the river that morning. Her knees hurt when the weather shifted, and the air had that sharp electric feel that made her bones ache. Most days she stayed close to her small cabin at the edge of town, tending to simple chores, keeping to herself. People knew her as Quiet Sarah, polite, helpful when asked, a woman who had lived a long life without ever really being seen. But that morning, something pulled at her. You know that feeling, right? When you wake up with a weight in your chest you can't explain, when your hands move before your mind catches up, when your feet carry you somewhere familiar even though you swear you weren't planning to go there. The river smelled different after the storm, raw, exposed, like it had peeled back its skin and was waiting for someone to notice. Trees lay uprooted along the banks, their roots twisted and naked in the air. Mud clung to everything. The water still moved fast, swollen and restless, but it wasn't angry anymore. It felt deliberate. Sarah walked slowly, leaning on her stick, her breath shallow. Every step closer made her heart beat harder, like it was recognizing the path before she did. And then she saw him. A man stood near the bend where the river curved away from the old plantation grounds. He was tall, taller than most, broad shoulders, strong hands. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either, somewhere in between. He wore a simple coat, worn at the edges, and his hair, dark, thick, curled slightly at the temples. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at the water. And the way he stood there, it stopped her cold, because it was the way Elijah used to stand. One foot slightly forward, hands loose at his sides, head tilted, like he was listening. Sarah's fingers tightened around her walking stick. Her mouth went dry. She hadn't said that name out loud in nearly 20 years. Elijah. People said he'd run. People said he'd drowned. People said lots of things. Sarah had learned long ago that the truth rarely cared what people said. The man turned then, slowly, as if he felt her eyes on him. And when their gazes met, the world shifted. You see, a mother knows. Not because of faces or features or logic, not because of proof, but because something inside her, something older than fear and stronger than memory, recognizes its own. The man's eyes widened, just a fraction, like he'd been holding his breath his entire life and had only just realized it. Sarah took a step forward. Then another. Her lips trembled. Her lips trembled. Her lips trembled. "Samuel?" she whispered. The name barely made a sound, but it was enough. The man's breath hitched. His hand went to his chest, fingers pressing hard like he was trying to steady a heart that had just broken free. "Yes," he said. His voice was low, steady, but underneath it, something cracked. "That's what she told me my name was." Sarah dropped her stick. It hit the mud with a soft, useless sound. She didn't notice. She was already reaching for him, her hands shaking, her steps unsteady. Samuel crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides and caught her before she could fall. She clutched at his coat like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "Oh God," she sobbed. "Oh God, you lived!" Samuel held her carefully, like he was afraid she might vanish if he held her too tightly. He closed his eyes and breathed her in, the scent of soap and age and something deeply familiar. "I've been looking for you," he said quietly, "for years." They stayed like that for a long time, long enough for the river to keep flowing, long enough for the past to settle around them like fog lifting from the water. Eventually, Sarah pulled back, her hands cupping his face, tracing it like she was memorizing every line. "They told me you were gone," she said. "They told me the river—" "I know," Samuel replied. "Different words, same lie." They sat together on a fallen log near the bank. The wooden box lay a few feet away, its lid open, its contents catching the light. Sarah stared at the tiny shirt inside, her fingers hovering over it. "I made that," she whispered. "In the evenings, by candlelight." Samuel swallowed hard. "Ruth kept it." "Ruth?" Sarah looked up. "The woman who hid me," Samuel said. "She raised me until I was old enough to understand. She told me everything she knew, about Elijah, about you, about the river." Sarah's eyes filled again, but this time there was something else there too. Anger, long buried, long denied. "Margaret Whitcomb," she said, the name bitter on her tongue. Samuel nodded. "I know." He had grown up hearing the story in pieces. Ruth never softened it. She believed truth didn't need decoration. She told him about the order, about the river, about the man who chose to run instead of obey. "Elijah saved you," Sarah said softly. "He saved you, and he saved me." Samuel looked toward the water. "Do you know what happened to him?" Sarah shook her head. "No one ever did. He never came back." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I think he wanted it that way." They sat in silence again, listening to the river. Now, here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Because Samuel hadn't come back just to find his mother. He had come back because the past had a way of pulling people toward unfinished business. After emancipation, Samuel had built a life, not an easy one, but a free one. He learned to read, to write. He worked on boats, on farms, in towns that didn't know his name or his story. But the river followed him. Every place he went, it seemed to echo in the background of his life. When the storm hit, when news spread about the flooding near his birthplace, something inside him shifted. And he returned. Not to accuse, not to demand, but to remember. Word spread quickly through the town once people realized who Samuel was, who his mother was, what the box meant. Some reacted with shame, others with denial, a few with quiet sorrow. Margaret Whitcomb's house had long since been sold. Her grave sat undisturbed in the small cemetery on the hill. Until Samuel went there. He stood before the stone, reading the words carved into it. Devoted wife, generous benefactor, pillar of the community. He didn't spit on it, he didn't curse, he didn't touch it. He just stood there. "You ordered my death," he said softly, "and then you forgot me." The wind moved through the trees, leaves rustled. Somewhere nearby, water flowed. Sarah waited for him at the edge of the cemetery. When he returned, she didn't ask what he said. She didn't need to. They walked back toward the river together, slowly, side by side. Two lives separated by violence, rejoined by survival. Before they parted that evening, Samuel knelt and pressed his forehead to Sarah's hands. "I don't know how much time we have, but I won't waste it." Sarah smiled through tears. "I already got a lifetime I wasn't promised. Anything else is a gift." As the sun dipped low, the river caught the light and turned gold, calm again, quiet, still. You see, the river never forgot the order it was given. It just refused to obey it. And years later, when the world was finally ready to listen, it returned the truth, not as punishment, not as revenge, but as proof. Proof that even in the darkest moments of history, someone chose mercy. Someone chose love. Someone chose to run. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. For a while after that day, the town didn't quite know what to do with itself. You could feel it in the way people spoke more softly near the river, in the way older folks suddenly remembered details they had once sworn they'd forgotten, in the way Margaret Whitcomb's name stopped being spoken with certainty and started being spoken with pauses. Stories like this don't explode, they seep. They slip into conversations at market stalls, into murmurs after church, into long looks exchanged between people who suddenly realized they were standing closer to cruelty than they ever admitted. And once that happens, once a story like this finds air, it doesn't go back into the ground quietly. Samuel stayed, not because the town welcomed him, some did, some didn't, but because the land itself felt unfinished without him. Because every morning he woke to the sound of the river and knew deep in his bones that this was where his life had begun and where it needed to be understood. He rented a small room at first, then a cabin closer to the water. He worked repairing boats, mending nets, hauling freight, honest work, hard work, the kind that leaves your hands sore and your mind clear. People watched him. They noticed how he listened more than he spoke, how he never raised his voice, how he treated Sarah with a gentleness that made some of them uncomfortable because it forced them to remember how easily she had once been stripped of everything. Children were the first to accept him. They always are. They followed him along the riverbank, asking questions, daring each other to touch the water, laughing when Samuel showed them how to skip stones. He told them stories, not about plantations or cruelty, but about rivers in other places, about storms and survival, about listening before speaking. And slowly, adults followed. One afternoon, an old man named Thomas approached him. Thomas had once worked under Margaret Whitcomb as a clerk. He had written numbers in ledgers while others carried whips. He had told himself he was neutral, that he was just doing a job. He stood beside Samuel in silence for a long time. "I remember that day," Thomas finally said. "Not the details, just the feeling. Something was wrong." Samuel didn't turn to him. "I told myself it wasn't my place," Thomas continued, his voice thin. "I told myself asking questions would only make things worse." The river lapped quietly against the shore. "Did it?" Samuel asked. Thomas swallowed. "No." That was how reckoning happened in this place, not with trials or speeches, but with conversations like that, one by one, honest, uncomfortable, necessary. Sarah watched it all from her porch. Some days she smiled, some days she wept quietly, the sound barely escaping her chest. She had lived long enough to know that justice didn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looked like truth refusing to stay buried. Her health wasn't strong. Samuel could see it, the way her steps slowed, the way her hands shook when she poured water. He stayed close without smothering her, learning the delicate balance between presence and respect. One evening, as the sky darkened and cicadas sang, Sarah asked him a question she'd held back for weeks. "Did you ever hate me?" she asked softly, "for not protecting me?" Samuel turned to her, startled. "Hate you? No." "But I was there," she whispered. "I didn't stop her." Samuel reached for her hand. "You survived," he said. "So did I. That wasn't failure. That was defiance." Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of decades loosening just a little. There was one more place Samuel needed to go. Not the cemetery, not the plantation ruins, the river bend where Elijah had vanished. Samuel walked there alone one morning before sunrise. The fog was thick, the air cool against his skin. He stood where he believed Elijah had once stood, holding a child and making an impossible choice. "I don't know where you went," Samuel said into the quiet. "I don't know if you lived a long life or a short one, but I want you to know this: what you did mattered." The river flowed on. "I lived, I loved, I came back." A bird took flight from the reeds, the water rippled just slightly. Samuel smiled. People often ask what became of the wooden box. Sarah kept it. Not as a relic, not as evidence, but as a reminder. She placed it near her bed, along with the tiny shirt and the folded paper bearing Samuel's name. Sometimes she touched it before sleeping, sometimes she didn't. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this: Margaret Whitcomb's order had failed. Not because the system collapsed overnight, not because cruelty disappeared of a night, but because one man had refused to obey, because a river had refused to erase, because time had refused to forget. When Sarah passed away the following spring, the town gathered in a way it never had before. Samuel stood by her grave, steady, composed, carrying grief that was heavy but not hollow. "She waited her whole life for the truth," he said quietly to those who stood near, "and she lived long enough to see it." The river ran high that season, fed by rain and melting snow, clear, unapologetic. Years later, people would still tell the story. Some would soften it, some would distort it, but the heart of it remained unchanged. Years passed after Sarah was laid to rest, and the town changed in ways that were subtle enough you might miss them if you weren't looking closely. The riverbank was cleared and rebuilt. A small dock went up where boats could tie off safely. Children learned to swim there in the summers, their laughter echoing across the water in a way that would have seemed impossible decades earlier. People said the river felt calmer now, kinder, as if it had finally exhaled. Samuel stayed through it all. He never married, not because he didn't believe in love, but because his life had already been shaped by it in ways too deep to explain easily. He kept Sarah's cabin, repairing it piece by piece, honoring it the way some people honored churches. He planted a small garden out back, tomatoes, beans, herbs, things that needed patience. And he talked. Not loudly, not publicly, but when people asked. Young men came to him with questions about their families. Older women came with stories they'd never told anyone else. Once a woman confessed that she'd seen Margaret Whitcomb leave the house the morning after the baby was born, her gloves spotless, her face composed. "I didn't stop her," the woman whispered, tears running down her cheeks. "I didn't stop anyone." Samuel listened. That was his gift. He never absolved, never condemned. He understood something most people never do, that guilt doesn't vanish when ignored. It festers. But when spoken aloud, when carried into the light, it can finally begin to loosen its grip. One afternoon, a schoolteacher asked Samuel if he'd come speak to her class. "They're learning about the old days," she said carefully, "about slavery." Samuel hesitated. History, when handled carelessly, can turn pain into spectacle. He'd seen that happen too many times. But then he thought of the children by the river, the way they laughed without fear, the way they didn't yet know how fragile that freedom was. "I'll come," he said, "but I won't lecture." He sat on a wooden chair in front of the class, hands folded, the sun spilling through dusty windows. The children stared at him, curious. "Do you know what the hardest thing about the past is?" Samuel asked them. They shook their heads. "It's that people think it's finished," he said, "but it's not. It lives in how we treat each other now." A young man raised his hand. "Did you ever meet bad people?" Samuel smiled gently. "I met people who did bad things," he said. "That's not the same." The teacher wiped her eyes. Outside, the river kept moving. Late in his life, Samuel began to write. Not a book, not a memoir, just pages, letters mostly, to Elijah, to Sarah, to a child he never had. He wrote about small moments, the feel of the river's mist on his face, the sound of Ruth's voice at night, the way Sarah's hands trembled when she finally held him again. He kept the pages in the wooden box. When Samuel died, quietly, in his sleep, the town gathered again. This time, the grief felt different. Heavier, yes, but also steadier, like something had been completed. They buried him near the river. No grand speeches, no stone engraved with false virtues, just his name, and beneath it, a simple line chosen by the children who had grown up skipping stones at his side. He was returned. And now, before we end, I want you to sit with something. Because this story isn't really about Margaret Whitcomb. She gave the order, yes, but history is full of people like her, people who confuse control with righteousness, morality with reputation. If we focus only on her, we miss the deeper truth. This story is about choice. Elijah could have obeyed. No one would have blamed him. Survival would have justified it. But he didn't. He chose uncertainty over obedience, mercy over safety. Ruth could have closed her door. No one would have questioned it. But she didn't. She chose risk. Sarah could have let grief hollow her out completely. She came close, but she lived. She waited. She endured. And the river, silent witness to it all, refuse to become a weapon. You see, history doesn't only move forward on the backs of laws and revolutions. Sometimes it shifts because of a single trembling moment when someone stands at the edge of what they're told is inevitable and steps another way. That's the secret the river carried for all those years. Not revenge, not punishment, but proof. Proof that even in a world built on cruelty, humanity can still interrupt the story. And if it happened once, it can happen again. The river keeps flowing. The question is, what will we choose to remember? Long after Samuel was gone, people still felt him near the river. Not in any mystical way, not as a ghost or a legend, but in the quieter sense. Like when you walk a familiar path and suddenly remember who once walked it beside you. Like when the wind moves through the reeds just right and brings back a voice you haven't heard in years. The wooden box didn't stay closed forever. After Samuel's passing, the school teacher, older now, gray at the temples, was entrusted with it, not because she was the most educated, but because she had listened. Because she understood that stories like this weren't meant to be locked away or displayed like trophies. They were meant to be handled carefully, passed on gently, told when someone was ready to hear them. She opened the box one evening by lamplight. Inside were the letters Samuel had written, some short, some long, some barely legible where emotion had overtaken his hand. She read them slowly, pausing often, letting the weight of each word settle. One letter stopped her. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply began, "If you're reading this, then I was allowed to live long enough to be understood." In it, Samuel wrote about the moment at the river, the one he didn't remember, but somehow carried inside him all the same. "I don't remember the water," he wrote, "but I've always felt it, like a hand at my back, steadying me. I believe some moments imprint themselves on us before we have language, before we have memory, and those moments shape who we become." The teacher closed the letter and stared at the flame. Outside, the river moved through the darkness. Eventually, the letters were shared, carefully, not all at once, not sensationalized. They were read at gatherings, quoted in classrooms, spoken aloud by people whose voices trembled with the responsibility of carrying them forward. The town began to change how it told its own history. The old plantation ruins were no longer described as grand or elegant. They were described honestly, as places where comfort was built on suffering, where silence had been mistaken for peace. A small marker was placed near the river bend. No names carved in stone, no dates, just words etched into wood, simple and direct. Here, a life was nearly taken. Here, it was chosen instead. Visitors sometimes asked who it was for. The answer was always the same: for anyone who needs to remember. Now, let me tell you something that doesn't often make it into documentaries. Stories like this don't end neatly. They echo. Years later, during another storm, not as fierce as the one before, but strong enough to swell the river, a young woman was found standing at the water's edge late at night. She was crying, clutching something small to her chest, her shoulders shaking. A passerby stopped. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then shook her head. They sat together by the river until the storm passed, until the woman could breathe again, until she chose life, not because someone commanded it, but because someone stayed. The next day, people talked about how lucky it was that someone had come along. But the older folks exchanged knowing looks. They understood something the younger ones were still learning: that places remember, that choices leave fingerprints on the world. That when mercy is chosen once, it makes room for others to choose it again. And so the river continued its quiet work, not erasing, not punishing, just bearing witness. If you stand there today, early in the morning, when the mist still clings to the surface and the world feels unfinished, you might notice how calm it feels, how steady, how patient. You might even feel it asking you something. Not accusing, not demanding, just asking. When the moment comes, and it always does, what will you do? Because history isn't only behind us, it's waiting. And like the river, it remembers what we choose. And so, before we part, let me bring you back to where we began. The river at dawn. Mist rising slowly, water moving without urgency, without anger, just forward, always forward. If you had stood there all those years ago, you wouldn't have seen anything extraordinary. No thunder, no miracle in the sky, just a man trembling at the edge of the water, holding a life he'd been ordered to erase. That's how history usually turns, not with noise, but with quiet moments no one thinks will matter. Margaret Whitcomb believed power was permanent. She believed her words could command the river itself, and for a while the world agreed with her. People stepped aside, doors closed, eyes turned away. But power built on cruelty has one fatal weakness. It depends on obedience. And that morning obedience failed. Elijah chose not to become a weapon. Ruth chose to open her door. Sarah chose to endure when she could have disappeared into grief. Samuel chose to return, not with vengeance, but with truth. And the river chose to remember. That's the part I want you to sit with. Because it's comforting to believe evil only exists in monsters. It's easier that way. But this story reminds us that cruelty often wears calm voices, clean gloves, respectable names. And it reminds us of something else too, something far more important, that goodness rarely announces itself. It shows up as a hesitation, as a door left unlocked, as a refusal whispered instead of shouted. History is shaped by those moments, not by the people who give orders, but by the ones who decide, quietly, not to follow them. If this story stayed with you, if it made your chest feel heavy or your throat tighten, that's not sadness alone, that's recognition. It's the part of you that understands how fragile humanity can be and how powerful it becomes when even one person chooses differently. The river still flows. It always will. But the question it asks remains the same, generation after generation. When you stand at the edge of what's expected of you, when silence feels safer than resistance, when obedience would be easier than compassion, what will you choose? Because one day, in ways you may never see, the river will remember your answer. And that is how stories like this never truly end.